So let's officially get going. And you know, it's just so great to see you all. It's great to have you interested in Bernheim and birds, as I said. And of course, those two go together. When you think of 16,000 acres of forest field, waterways, you know, incredibly high quality habitat that has been nature given and in some cases restored by Bernheim, you know, you can't help but think biodiversity, and birds are at the top of that list. They're just incredible creatures, and we're about to hear why, you know, in part why they're such amazing creatures tonight. You know, Bernheim's been tracking golden eagles for a number of years now. Just to give you a quick update, Harper checked in just the other day for the first time up at Churchill on the Hudson Bay, and he tends to go off and hunt while Athena is at one of 3 nest sites building nests. So they share the labor and they share the love. So we hope they're going to be successful this year. Of course, we've also been tracking little songbirds, and you're going to hear about the brains of songbirds tonight. But we've been tracking those using the MODIS system. And we're very excited because we're the first organization in Kentucky to have MODIS installed, and we're working with others to enhance that network. So it's another way for us to learn about the plight of birds and try to do something about it. You know, one of the most important things about birds is we use them at Bernheim to connect people with nature. And that is our mission. And we're so proud when we get, you know, young kids excited by a bird call or excited by seeing an indigo bunting or a bluebird or, you know, a cardinal for that matter. It doesn't matter. They're all amazing creatures. And speaking of which, before I introduce Dr. Barney Schlinger, our ornithologist in residence, I want you to know that he's had a long day. He was up at 6 o'clock this morning with Andrew Berry, our director of conservation, and Evan Patrick, our forest manager, and myself. And we were doing a quick bird survey of the proposed LG&E pipeline route across our Cedar Grove Wildlife Corridor. It was phenomenal. Now it's still a little early and you can ask Dr. Schlinger about all this later, but we ended up with over 30 birds identified, some real beauties too, first sightings for the spring. We also found some wonderful salamanders and lots of box turtles that love that habitat that would be impacted by that pipeline. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons for us to study nature. And one of those is so that we understand it, we appreciate it, and we protect it. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Barney Schlinger, who is professor of integrative biology and physiology, professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at UCLA. He's also an associate researcher at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama and a Humboldt Award winner and visiting scientist at the Max Planck Institute of Ornithology in Germany. He's published over 175 research papers, book chapters, and is working on a book of his own right now, in fact, mostly on birds, and I can tell you, he's an avid bird watcher. In full disclosure, Dr. Schlinger and I were office mates in graduate school, and I credit him for delaying my doctorate degree by at least a year, just because we spoke so much about science and nature and the world. But with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Barney Schlinger, who's going to speak on the language and brains of birds and humans. Dr. Schlinger, take it over.
Well, thanks, Mark, and thanks to everyone for being involved and for joining in. I'm very honored to be a part of Bernheim. It's a very special place, and I'm really happy to be able to tell you about my research. And again, I'm really happy to answer questions. I know they're hoping that you wait till the end, but if you want to get on the chat feature and ask a question, if there's something that we need to talk about right away, maybe they can interrupt me. Because I started out as a field biologist, and I got so interested in how birds behave and what they do that it took me into the laboratory to try to understand just how birds were able to do what they do. As I think all of you might be aware, I mean, birdsong, it's a ubiquitous feature of our planet. It's just hard to imagine our planet without being somewhere where you're hearing birdsong. Maybe in Antarctica is the only place where you wouldn't hear birdsong, but everywhere else, it's maybe the dominant acoustic feature of our planet. And of course, Bernheim is a very special place for songbirds because we have a lot of really beautiful and songbirds, but also ones that have spectacular song. But there are many interesting songbirds throughout the planet. There's just a paradise tanager from South America, a Wilson's bird of paradise from New Guinea, and a lyrebird from Australia. That the sounds that you heard when we started was just a recording of sounds of songbirds singing in the forest of New Guinea. And there's just an extraordinary diversity of song. So we're going to be talking about brains, and I don't want to get too complicated with discussions of brains. So I hope to keep it, relatively simple. But I think it's really important that we are aware that birds just aren't the bird brains that we used to think of them. This slide just shows you a traditional perspective where, the human obviously has this enormous brain on the bottom. And if you look, the first three, the fish, the reptile, and the bird are shown having these very small brains. But in fact, songbirds have quite large brains. This is showing their entire, the large telencephalons, it's called. It looks very much almost like a human brain. And of course, it's very small because the birds are small. But of course, when you look at a human, a lot of what you're seeing, the space that you're seeing, is the thickness of the skull. And in the bird, the skull is very, very thin, paper thin. So what you see is their head largely is their brains. So these songbirds have very large brains, and we can learn a great deal from them and have learned a great deal from them. So what have we learned? Well, and again, there are laboratories all over the world that are studying songbirds. For one thing, they have a language. They learn their songs just like humans learn our languages. And so we've learned a lot about just how language can be learned by studying songbirds. A part of what we've learned from songbirds is they have tremendous plasticity in their brains. Many of us grew up thinking that our brain was fixed throughout life, but that's just not true. There is this plasticity that the brain can change, and a lot of that we've learned from studies of songbirds, and that has tremendous implications for studies of brain injury or recovery from brain injury or stroke or neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease. There's also a lot of conflicting thinking about whether humans have sex differences in the brain. And a good deal of work has been done on songbirds that show how and where sex differences exist and how they develop. And the last thing, I may not have time, but I want to talk about how really the female hormone estradiol is an extremely important hormone for both males and female humans, but we know a lot about that from studies of songbirds. So, what is a songbird? Well, it's not a penguin or an ostrich or an eagle or a sandpiper or a pigeon or even a woodpecker. Sandpiper, the songbirds are these small perching birds that are the typical small birds that you see perched around your yard or in the forest. They're actually relatively closely related to parrots and even to falcons, strangely enough. They're divided into these two groups. There are the Oscine songbirds, illustrated here by this zebra finch, and we'll talk about them in more detail in a minute. And there are the suboscene songbirds shown here by this flycatcher here. And we'll talk about those differences in just a second. Now, so how do birds sing? All of the sounds that you hear, the remarkable sounds when you walk through the forest, how do the birds do that? Well, they have a syrinx. It's different from our larynx. But the way the syrinx works is there are these membranes on the sides of where the trachea meets the bronchi, the bronchial tubes. And as those membranes vibrate as the bird breathes in or breathes out, those vibrations are what creates the sounds that we hear as song. And the bird also can, just like we can change our shape of our mouth or the movement or the position of our tongues or the way that we hold our necks, birds do the same thing and can change the sounds that they make in the same way. But this syrinx of the bird, the tightness of those membranes that are vibrating when air goes past is controlled by a bunch of muscles that surround the trachea and the bronchi. And this is showing you an oscine songbird. These are just muscles on the outside of the syrinx. And this is the syrinx of one of these suboscines, these flycatchers. There's very little musculature, but the songbirds have a lot. And it's the contraction of all those muscles in discrete, small little ways that allow the birds to be able to produce the remarkable kinds of sounds that they produce. So why do birds sing? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. It's mostly that males sing to attract females. They are alerting other males to their presence. They sing to defend or define a territory. The quality of the song can be assessed by the female, and she can say, well, that's a male I want to get to know, or that's a male, I'm not so interested in him, by the quality of their song. The females will choose a male to copulate based on the quality of his song. But in some species, both the males and females sing. And some of the most remarkable examples of this are the duetting songbirds, many of which are in the tropics, where they keep in contact. They produce a single song, but each, the male and the female, produce the different syllables, and they do it absolutely perfectly. And we can talk more about that later if you'd like. So I mentioned that birds learn their song, just like humans learn language. And a lot of work has been done on these zebra finches. You know them because they're a pet store bird. This is the male on the right and the female on the left. And but they have a song. It's kind of a squeaky little wheezy song. I'll play it in just a minute. But they breed well in captivity. They're easy to take care of because they do all the work themselves. They build their nests, they lay the eggs, they raise the young. All we have to do is provide them seed and water. And so they're a terrific model to study. So I'll be talking about them a fair bit in just a minute. Now, when we talk about songs, we often analyze them by looking at these things called spectrograms or sonograms. It's a visual depiction of the song. So what you can see along this axis is the time in seconds. So this is a 5-second presentation of a song. And the song is composed of these different elements or syllables or notes that are shown here. Now, this axis from the bottom to the top is the frequency of the song. So it goes from low down up to high on this axis. And the darkness is the amplitude, so how loud. So this is actually showing you a breath of a bird. It's very soft. Here's a very loud note, and here's a little bit of a softer note. And so you can see there's a lot of complexity to the acoustic pattern here. And we'll see a bit more of this in just a minute. So now there's a bunch of things on this slide, but I want to point out just how really interesting song learning in birds can be. And I want to start with this middle one, which is the zebrafinch. So I'm going to play the little zebrafinch song here. Can you hear it? It's a little soft, maybe. It's a squeaky little song. Can you, Mark, can you raise your hand? Did you hear it? Okay. All right. So So the bird learns his song. This zebrafinch learns his song in the first 100 days of his life. And it starts out with a sensory period where the bird has to hear his father sing. And that happens between like 15 to 60 days of age. But then what the bird does is it starts basically babbling. It produces what's called subsong or plastic song. And during that period of time, the bird is actually vocalizing, but it's listening to the vocalizations that it's making, and it's matching the sounds that it's producing with the template or the memory of the father's song that it produced during the sensory period. So this is a learning phase. This is when the memory is formed. This is the sensory motor, when the motor output or the singing is matched to the sensory. And then in the zebrafinch at about 100 days of age, it becomes crystallized. Whatever the bird learned and practiced, that's the song it's going to have for the rest of its life. So that all happens in 100 days. But then there's other interesting birds, like some of the sparrows, like a white-throated sparrow or white-crowned sparrow that you know about around here. In that case, the little hatchling bird is sitting in the nest. He hears his father's song during this sensory phase, and he stores that memory, that complete, perfect acoustic memory, until autumn or winter of the next year, and sometimes into the springtime. And that's when he starts practicing, and they start babbling, and he then can relate his output to what the father sang. And then ultimately that song gets crystallized. So the bird holds that acoustic memory in his brain for 6 months until he then matches it perfectly. It's an extraordinary memory process. Then you have a bird like the canary, and the canary can do this year after year, but it can change its song. So it can add new elements every springtime and go through the process of learning it and practicing it and then singing it. And then the next year it can do the same thing, can add new elements again. And you all might be thinking about birds like mockingbirds, where they are hearing a sound in the wild. I mean, think about how remarkable that is. They hear a sound and they're able to replicate it perfectly by their own vocalization, by just matching what they hear with what the sound is they produce. It's a remarkable neurobiological problem. So this just shows this in the zebrafinch in a little more detail. They acquire the sound, the sensory acquisition, they practice, and then they crystallize it. So for example, if you play a bird, you can use a tutor instead of a father. If you play it song A at this point in time and you play it song B at this point in time, it'll sing A because that happened during the sensory acquisition phase. If you play it two songs, A and B, well, it seems to prefer the song that it heard in the latter part of the sensory acquisition, but it can learn both of them. So it's just like human language. They learn what they hear, they babble to repeat it until they produce the sound that they heard. And you can see this learning process again. This is one of these sonograms. I'm just going to play you this song again. So each of those little notes is represented by these little bars on this sonogram. And this is the tutor song that the baby heard. Well, at 40 days of age, if you look down, well, here at 100 days of age, this is the baby's song at 100 days of age. You can see it looks exactly like what the parent sang. I mean, it's a perfect copy. But down here at 40 days of age, the bird's song was kind of rough. And it got better at 60 days, it got better at 80 days, and by 100 days, it was a perfect version of the father. And so that's the whole sensory motor process. They're learn dad's song, and they can repeat it by practice. Now, some of you may be aware of the flycatchers that we have around here. They are subausine birds, and they have typically these simple kinds of songs. And if you take a baby eastern phoebe, for example, some of you may have them nesting on your houses or structures. If you deafen a little baby, It can sing the adult song perfectly well as an adult. It doesn't learn that song. But if you deafen a little baby zebrafinch, shown here, here was the father's song, here's the deafened son, and it produces a very poor quality song, whereas the intact son sings a perfect one. So they have to have that auditory input to be able to make the comparison. Again, it's a little bit like a person who is born and they're unable to hear. So this is where it gets a little tricky, because how birds sing is very complicated in their brains. And I don't care that you know all of these different structures, but trust me, each of these little areas of the brain that's outlined here plays an important role in how the bird sings. So remember, the syrinx over here is where the vocal organ, those are the muscles. The bird has to breathe properly to be able to sing, but it's these various brain regions that are all working together to allow the bird to be able to produce that song. So some of these brain areas are involved in the auditory processing. So they're hearing the sounds and they're processing that in these areas called field L and NCM. Don't have to remember these things. But then there are special areas that are involved in the motor output. So this nucleus HVC that I'm pointing at top here, if you were to put an electrode in that brain area while a bird was singing, you would see it spiking electrically at every time the note came out from the bird's syrinx. And finally, there are areas of the brain over in this part of the brain that are just responsible for the bird learning the song. So again, I'm going to talk a little bit about more of some of these areas later, but I just hope you appreciate just how complex the brain of this bird is. And it's doing all of these different things. Now, one of the important features of this is that it's hormones that are responsible for activating singing and doing many of the things that we see. So this is a picture of a song sparrow singing. Many of you may know their song. You know, they're silent, or they're pretty silent in the wintertime, shown at the beginnings of these slides. But what this slide is actually showing you is changes in the testosterone levels in the blood of the males. So here's the testosterone levels rising in the springtime and in the summertime when the birds, these dark bars are showing you when they're being sexual and when they're singing. So, and then their testosterone levels declines again all throughout the late summer and fall, and declines to nothing in the wintertime. And here's a European blackbird. Again, they have a single peak of testosterone and they have a single period of singing in the spring and early summer. So hormones control singing, but it raises the question is what is occurring in the brain of these birds when the songs appear and disappear? Is their brain different in the wintertime when they're not singing than it is in the springtime than when they are singing? And the answer is decidedly yes. So I want to point out this one slide here. Again, there's a lot of things on this slide, but there's just one main point here, is that many of these areas of the brain of the songbird are sensitive to hormones. So hormones all act through receptors in the neurons. There are androgen receptors and estrogen receptors, and all of these different areas that I mentioned before, like HVC, this RA, the learning parts of the brain, they all can respond to hormones. And we have regions in our brains that respond to hormones as well. So what do these hormones do? Well, here's a great example. So this is a spotted towhee. Many of you are aware of the eastern towhee, which is very similar to the spotted towhee that's found in the West. But here's a brain of a bird of birds that have been sectioned in different times of the year, in the wintertime and in the springtime. So in the springtime, the bird is singing. The wintertime, it's not. Well, this is that nucleus in the top of the brain called HVC that is stained. And you can see the dark stain that's outlined here. This is nucleus HVC in the springtime. And you can see that same nucleus in the wintertime. It is much smaller. Here's another nucleus. that's been stained. And the staining here is all these little dots that you see, these are individual neurons. So here's the nucleus RA in the spring when the bird is singing, and here it is in the winter. It's much smaller. And here's a nucleus called RAX. It's a very big nucleus that's involved in song learning. And again, it's much bigger in the springtime and it's small in the winter. And of course, it's in springtime when the testosterone levels are elevated and the wintertime when testosterone levels are low. So this is remarkable. We'd love to have our brains be able to change like that. We could turn off behaviors that we don't like. We could turn on behaviors that we do like. If a region of our brain got damaged and it shrunk, we'd like to be able to regrow it again. And the birds do it naturally every year. Well, how do they do it? Well, this is a slide just showing you some of these processes of seasonal plasticity. Here's a neuron, the same neuron or a similar kind of neuron. This is it in the springtime. You can see it's larger. It has many of these processes, these dark processes that are extending out, and has a really long axon that may be coming out. Here's a neuron in the wintertime. It's much smaller. It has very few connections with other neurons. It has a much smaller axon. So the neurons themselves can shrink and grow. Well, that's cool. And by shrinking and growing, they make many, many more connections. And it's all those connections is what gives the brain its power to do things. It gives us the power for us to think in such complex ways because we make connections with many, many other neurons. But the other thing that happens in these birds is that some of those neurons can die and be replaced by brand new neurons. This is called neurogenesis, and I'm highlighting it here because we would love to be able to generate many new neurons in our brains. And we can do it in a couple of small parts of our brains, but not in most parts of our brains. And the birds can do it in many parts of their brains. So there are many investigators who are working hard to understand how songbirds can maintain the ability to make new neurons throughout their whole adult life, whereas we tend to do it only when we're babies and young and children. In fact, neurogenesis in a vertebrate animal or in a higher vertebrate was actually first discovered in songbirds. And people said, wait a minute, if songbirds are doing it, maybe humans do it too. And they went and started and they looked at monkeys and they found that monkeys could do it. They looked at humans and they found that we could do it. They just discovered that songbirds do it more than we do. So what about brain sex differences? I mentioned that. You know, a lot of people have questions about whether or not humans have brain sex differences. That's a very controversial topic, and I'm not going to speak to that. But for example, in this zebra finch, the adult males never sing as an adult, even if they're given the male hormone testosterone. So here's our female here, and here's our male here. She will never sing. Well, one of the reasons why she doesn't sing is because there are prominent sex differences that exist in the brain. This is that nucleus HVC on the top of the brain that's involved in the motor output of song. That's the male HVC. Well, this is the female HVC. It is completely shrunken compared to the male, and it exists that way for the rest of her life. This is that nucleus RA in the male brain of an adult male. Here's the RA of a female, adult female. It's much smaller. It has very few neurons. It doesn't do very much at all. So,
hey, Barney, we have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Tyrion wants to know if both males and females, if they both sing the father's song.
The female doesn't sing at all. The male does. The female can learn the father's song, and she uses what she learns to make choices about the male that she may mate with. But she herself, in the zebrafinch at least, never sings.
Thank you.
Yep. So there are sex differences in the brain. But you may be wondering, what about a strange bird like this? Now, have you ever seen or heard of what's called a gonadromorph? It's a bird. Can you see this zebrafinch? He's totally male on this side and he's totally female on this side. This is that same bird facing to the left or right, and here's that same bird facing to the left. Well, some of you may know about these birds because they exist in the wild too. Here's a cardinal that is totally male on his left side and totally female on his right side. It's amazing. And nobody knows exactly how these birds arise. But you may wonder, well, in the zebrafinch where the male sings and the female doesn't, what does that bird's brain look like? Well, here's what it looks like. This is that nucleus HVC on the right side of the bird's brain. That's this dark area that's stained here. And you can see the right side of this bird is the male side. And you can see that the female side is smaller. So these brains are different because the genetics of the males and the genetics of the females are different. And the left side of this bird carries the female chromosomal complement. In birds, it's just the opposite of the male. The female is ZW. They call it ZW and not XY like in mammals. The female is ZW and the male is ZZ. So the male is ZZ on the whole right side of his body, including his brain, and ZW on the left side. It's quite remarkable. So it's an interesting bird phenomenon. So I'm moving along at a good pace here. I'm going to have a lot of time for questions. So I want to go to this very last section because I think many people have this idea that estrogens are female hormones and testosterone or androgens are male hormones. And I hope that after the next few minutes, you will discard that idea, because it turns out that in order to make estradiol, the female hormone, the hormone that you think females have in their blood that males don't have, in order for the female ovary to make estradiol, she has to make the male hormone testosterone, because all estradiol comes from testosterone. Okay? So if males are making testosterone, and they do this in the ovary because there's an enzyme that is in fact called aromatase. You can see it up here. Scientists also call it CYP19, which is shown in this picture here, but don't worry about that. It's called aromatase. So females have aromatase in their ovary. They make testosterone, but the ovary converts a lot of that testosterone, not all of it, but some of it to estradiol. So the question is, do males have the aromatase enzyme to make estradiol out of the testosterone that they secrete in their testes? And we do. And I say we do because we have the aromatase enzyme in our brains, and so do songbirds. So this is a cross section of an entire brain of a songbird. And this whole thing, is a little difficult to see, but everything that is darkly stained, the black staining that you see, that is the staining for the enzyme aromatase that makes estrogen. If I looked in my brain, I would find some of this aromatase enzyme. I am making estrogen in my brain, and presumably all of you are out there as well. Females do as well. Turns out estrogens are really powerful at modulating many things in the brain. And I'll tell you about that a little bit more in just a minute. But how does that affect the bird? Well, so this top panel is showing you can do an experiment with a zebrafinch, for example, and you can put him in a cage with perches like this. And you can have two speakers, one on either side, and you can either play his own song back to him, or you can play another zebrafinch song to him. Well, it turns out the male likes to sit on the perch next to his own song. And that's shown in this graph down here. About 80%, so you can see there's a 0.8 here, about 80% of the time, they will sit next to the speaker that plays their own song. If you do an experiment on these birds where you treat them with a drug that blocks their brain's ability to make estrogen, the male spends 50% of his time here and 50% of his time here. He cannot distinguish his song versus another bird's song. Turns out it only happens on the left side of his brain. So just like language with us, it's lateralized, but it's also showing you how important it is for the male's brain to make estradiol. Now, so first of all, what I like to say to people is when you look up and you see a cardinal sitting in the tree or a robin singing, I want you to look at that bird and I want you to see that, yes, it has a very cool brain. It's doing all sorts of things, but it's making estrogen. Every bird, songbird you see is making estrogen in its brain. So that's one of the lessons from this talk. But the other is, it turns out if you damage our brain or the brain of any other mammal or the brain of a bird, there are these other cells in the brain called glial cells or astrocytes. One of the first things they do is they upregulate that enzyme aromatase so they can make more estrogen. And in the songbird, they can repair brain injuries by making estrogen. If you damage the bird's brain and you block its ability to make estrogen, the damage after the injury is far worse. And the same thing happens in mice and rats. So there's more work that needs to be done on humans, but estrogens are really important for both behavior in the brain and also for neural repair and that plasticity that is so important. So I just kind of want to end with this point. Many of you may have seen things about songbirds as being very intelligent. A lot of work's been done on ravens and crows and jays. They have memory. They can time with memory. They can say, gee, I formed that memory a week ago, but I formed another memory 2 weeks ago, and the one 2 weeks ago is more important or less important. They have very profound capabilities. And it in part arises from the fact that they have extraordinary brains. And we now know that many of the parts of the brain, like this HVC and the RA that I talked about, we now know that those brain areas in the bird are equivalent to our cortex. People used to think that birds didn't have a cortex like mammals do. We were special, but it turns out scientists now know that they do have a cortex just like ours. So birds and humans share a lot, the songbirds at least, and humans share a lot in common with language, with plasticity of our brains, maybe with sex differences, but they're very worthy of our respect. They're very worthy of our protection. So they're not just beautiful to look at and beautiful to listen to, but it's beautiful to think about just how remarkable and complex are their brains. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'm really happy to answer any questions you might have, or I can talk about anything. So feel free to ask me questions.
Amy, if you see any of the questions before me, feel free to share.
You have to go to chat.
So Barney, so you're telling me that if someone calls me, says I've got a bird brain, that's a compliment?
Absolutely.
I will look at it that way. Now, that was fascinating.
Barney, if you would stop sharing your screen, we could see our gallery.
Okay.
and see if anybody wants to ask a question or has questions. And yeah, I agree. I'm never going to be able to look at a singing bird again the same way. So there we go, Cindy.
Yeah, hi. This has been really enlightening. Couple quick questions. So I kind of know what attracts birds to hit your window, and in that they're seeing maybe a tree or flowers, or thinking it's a clear pathway. And I've heard a lot of varying things as to what to put in your windows or what to do to help keep them from doing that. Do you have any specific suggestions?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, the
Good ones.
really the best thing, frankly, is to put screens up on the outside so that the bird hits the screen. There are these decals that you can put up that reflect ultraviolet light, and those are pretty good. The problem with that is, I mean, I have them all over the windows of my house, and you know, I'm used to them. I don't see them anymore, but I think other people see them. You know, some people put up those falcon shapes, and those are supposedly not as protective as people would like them to be. So I think those UV things are very good. You know, the other thing is that you can just hang strings. Frankly,
We have ribbons all over our windows.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it
But-
works sometimes, but not always.
You know, some of the birds, you know, I think in particular doves and pigeons, their visual system is such that they're picking up something from the window reflection that makes it very hard to protect them. But some of the other birds are quite, you know, it works. They're quite effective.
Thank you.
Barney, we have another question from Terry, and she wants to know do bird brains change with age?
That's a great question. And there's so first of all, I mean, I can answer that in a number of different ways. I mean, some of you may know that some birds are very long-lived. You know, there's this albatross in the Pacific that's been nesting for 65 years and laying eggs and raising young for at least 65 years. You know, people have parrots that live to be 80 years or older, and they continue to function perfectly well. So there's no evidence that those birds are experiencing any of the kind of neurodegenerative problems. And again, you know, smaller animals tend to have shorter lifespans. So I mean, even a big albatross still may only weigh, you know, say it weighs 10 pounds or 12 pounds. That's a small animal. So for it to live its life for that long with the little neurodegeneration is quite impressive. But a lot of the songbirds, these small birds, they live 10, 12, you know, once they make it through their first year, they can live 10, 12 years, you know, a 9-gram chickadee. So there's no evidence that they're experiencing neurodegenerative properties. They do seem to show some decrements, small decrements in memory, but it's there aren't that many studies, and the losses they show are not that great. So that's the best answer I can give.
Any more questions? I don't see any in the chat, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like.
I have one more.
I have one.
Tarian?
Yeah, even if your song, does every male have a mate, even if his song isn't glorious?
I'm hearing a couple of different voices simultaneously.
I said, does every male have a mate, even if his song is not glorious?
Can
he still find somebody?
Yes, not every male has a mate. In fact, there are a large number of birds that are called floaters that will often just wait for a territory to be abandoned. Either the resident male will die, and those floaters will rather quickly acquire a territory. Um, so um, so females are very choosy about the males, and they choose them based on all sorts of different characteristics. The quality of the territory, the quality of the male, his song. You know, when you hear a bird doing a
The credit
trill,
rating.
you know, some of the birds like chipping sparrows you may have around, you know, they do a trill. That's actually quite hard for the bird to do, by the biomechanics and the energy that goes into it. So the length of the trill, for example, can tell the female if that male is of more quality than one that has a little bit shorter trill, and she's able to capture that and sense it. So yep,
I have
they're
a
not so different
question.
from humans after all.
How does the mockingbird compare with the finch as far as learning its song or mimicking?
Yeah. So mockingbirds are the mimics are quite remarkable, and it's actually unfortunate that we don't know as much about them, because they seem to be like the canary that I talked about, that they can add new elements every year, but they have a much greater capacity to add new elements. And not only to add new elements, but well, I showed you the picture of the lyrebird from Australia. I don't know if any of you've seen any of the David Attenborough nature programs, but lyrebirds, you know, they have perfect copies of producing sounds like a chainsaw, or the sounds of cameras clicking. So they're not even bird-like sounds. You know, mockingbirds tend to they copy, or starlings even do a lot of mimicry, but they tend to produce sounds within a narrow range of you know, quality and such. So how they're able to do that, or parrots for that matter, they learn to talk. They're producing sounds that are really quite beyond the normal squawk of the parrot, and there's just not as much known about it. And it's um, you know, I think that, like I mentioned, if you go into that nucleus HVC, if you were to put an electrode in of a bird like a chipping sparrow that was going, you know, what you'd see is a pattern of some neurons that were firing, you know, and it would be telling the syrinx to fluctuate in just that pattern. But with a lyrebird, or something that's making a large array of notes, that HVC, many of those neurons must be doing very different things to tell the muscles of the syrinx to do very different things simultaneously, so they can produce such complex sounds. When you hear I can go on, but when you hear a thrush, you know, a beautiful wood thrush, or you know, a Swainson's thrush singing in the forest, they are often singing two separate sounds out of each side of their syrinx. So they're harmonizing with themselves. That's part of what makes their songs so beautiful. So their HVCs on the different sides of their brain are telling those two sides to do slightly different things. So it can get really complex.
A
Thank you.
question, with when you have the neuronal degeneration from any reason, if you add systemic estrogens, does that affect the regeneration or neuronal regeneration?
Well, if you, yes and no. So when the excuse me, the new neurons are born, but they have to then migrate from the place where they're born to get into one of these nuclei in the brain, and that is controlled by estrogens. So the migration is estrogen dependent. The birth of those new neurons seems to be dependent on some other factors that people are still trying to understand. But once that neuron migrates, so for example, that the TOE that I showed you where the brain region shrinks in the wintertime, the reason it shrinks is because the male's testosterone goes away. So those neurons are completely dependent upon the testosterone. When the male's testes stop secreting testosterone, the neurons either shrink or die, and they do it within hours. It's amazingly dependent.
Yeah.
So again, people are still trying to understand how all that pieces together.
I have a
All right.
question.
Oh,
I have a
go ahead.
question.
I was gonna say,
One
we
more.
still have some more on the chat too, Mark,
Okay.
but go ahead.
Yes, this is a little off subject, but a friend of mine recently advised me of the salmonella problem around our bird feeders.
Yes.
Can you comment on perhaps the scope and extent of that problem, especially in this part of the country?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can. I heard that it was really severe in the Pacific Northwest. And so I'm coming from Los Angeles, so I haven't heard what's going on elsewhere. We were worried that it was going to spread south into California, and I know people are taking precautions, but I haven't heard. And I mean, Mark or somebody else may know more about what's going on around here, but I don't.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I've got a couple, I think 2 questions I'm gonna read off the chat, so I might disappear for a minute. All right, let's see. This one's from Kurt Mason, and he says, during the summer, there are hummingbirds all over my neighborhood, and they seem to be the same ones over and over, but I never seem to be able to locate their nest. What is the general distance they travel from feeding sites and nests during a day?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. I'm familiar with hummingbirds in the tropics and how far they travel, which is often not terribly far. But my guess is that if you have hummingbirds coming to your feeder, well, in California, I mean, we put up a hummingbird feeder on our deck, and I know there are hummingbirds nesting within 15, 20 feet of my deck. So the ruby-throated, I guess, is probably quite similar. But they're really hard to see, and they're really small, and so it's tough.
Ruby-throateds can run a trap line of hitting several feeders in a row and gardens in a row, and then somewhere within very short distance of one of those, less than a quarter of a mile, they're going to be feeding. So they're going to be nesting. So it's really close to feeders.
All right, I think I have our last question, and that is there anything that can make songbirds lose their voice in the spring?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when they crash into a window, that'll stop it right there.
They don't get laryngitis or anything like that?
I've not heard of that. I mean, so that would be,
Bird pathologist.
there's a lot of selection against losing your voice if you're a male songbird.
Yeah.
So,
Hey,
Barney.
I have one last question.
Can
Okay.
I ask, sorry, can I just ask a question? It's nice to see you again.
Yeah.
I'll never forget when I went on my first professional bird watch. I went with a local man, many of you on the call may remember or know, Brainerd Palmer Ball. So we went out on this bird watch, and what was quite distinctive was I found him looking at the ground. And he was looking at the ground, of course, because he wasn't trying to see a bird. He was just listening for birds. And he said, oh, that's a this and that's a that. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is you describe bird songs as being sort of very individual with the father teaching the language. And yet obviously each species has a unique sound and language.
that's right.
And even if you think about, human language, we have different dialects and this and that. So I'm trying to understand how we can use language bird songs as a foolproof way of identifying species when it seems to be such an individualistic exercise, in each, family of birds, right?
Well, I mean, let me, I think you can think about it in a similar way that you can think about human language. I mean, we have dialects. I mean, I've been in Kentucky for the last month, and I've heard dialects that are different from what I hear in California. I grew up in Texas. I mean, I used to have a dialect that I've lost, at least for the most part. But it's the same language. It's different from Chinese or Mandarin. And it's the same with the birds. I mean, your white-throated sparrow is going to sing a white-throated sparrow song, although there may be variation in the length of it or in the exact frequency of it, but there is a pattern and the frequency range and the amplitude and the patterning of it is somewhat restricted. So you can't take a white-throated sparrow and play it a chipping sparrow song when it's in its early development, and it just won't learn the chipping sparrow song because it's too different. So, but yes, the dialects are extremely important because the female also hears her father's song and memorizes it. And in some cases, the female purposefully chooses to mate with a male that has a similar dialect. If you travel across the country and you hear, the song sparrows that I hear singing here have a different, I can tell it's a song sparrow like that, but it's a different song than the one that I hear in California. And the female song sparrows are clearly able to identify those differences.
So can you tell us why the white-throated sparrow is changing its song?
Yeah, so that was a big thing in the news just recently. I mean, I think that there's some discussion about urbanization as being responsible for it, or there being some selection for certain dialects that are succeeding more than others, and so they're drifting into the other dialects. But I don't know the full answer to the story. The white-throated sparrow is an extraordinary songbird for those of you who know them, because they actually exist in these two morphs. You have, the white striped morph and the tan striped morph. And in this case, the white striped morph males sing, and they only breed with the tan striped morph females who don't sing, and the white striped females sing, and the tan striped males sing a little bit, and white striped females only nest with the males, mate with the males. So there's this strange assortative mating system that's based on a chromosomal abnormality, but not abnormality, a chromosomal inversion. But it's so that's what I.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're running a little bit over at this point. I would like to tell you that our ornithologists and residents would answer your questions all night, but we're going to close this out in a moment. I'd like Cadell Walker to say a few words for Bernheim, but Dr. Schlinger, if you'd stay on for another 10 minutes after Cadell's done. For those who want to leave, need to leave, thank you so much for your time and attention tonight. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned a new respect for birds and their brains and their songs and the reason we work so hard to protect them at Bernheim. Cadell Walker, would you close this out? And then Dr. Schlinger will stay on for a few minutes for a few more questions.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. So this Zoom tonight is part of our Giving Circles donor perks that we have, a way to thank our donors for their support. And so we have a couple actual in-person, can you believe it? In-person Giving Circle donor events that we have coming up that I wanted to share for you. You'll get more information about these, but I just wanted you to mark the dates on your calendar. So Friday, May 21st from 3 till 6. That's going to be a sneak peek for our donors to be able to see Play Ecosystem, which is Bernheim's new 10-acre natural play area that's going to be opening across from the Visitors Center. So Zone 1 is going to be complete. And so we are going to allow our Giving Circle donors to take a sneak peek, take a tour, come play with us safely, social distance in the play area. From 3 to 6. I wanted you guys to know about that. It will be opening to the public on Saturday, May 22nd. So that's really exciting, but I wanted you guys to know that's coming up. We're going to do something similar with Jason Fan, who is our next big thing at Bernheim. So he is an artist from Big Sur, California. He's going to be building Spirit Nest in Zone 2 of Play Ecosystem. So we're going to invite Giving Circle donors out for a sneak peek of that before it's open to the public, and that's going to be June 11th. So we'll be sending out some more information about both of those events, but I just wanted you all to mark them on your calendar. And I hope you guys are excited to actually come out to Bernheim in person and visit with us again as much as we are for you to come out and do that. So we look forward to that. You'll be getting some information about it. And then I guess I'll turn it over to questions to Barney if you guys want to stay on, or if you have any questions for us about those two events.
Thank
What was-
you.
What's the date of the first event?
It's Friday, May 21st.
I have this one more question. I promise there's one more. What happens if the male baby bird is separated from his father at birth, falls out of the nest, something happens to the dad? Does he never learn to sing?
Well, again, it's if he never hears his father sing or another or a tutor, of the same species, he'll sing as an adult, but it'll be a poor quality song.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Additional questions, anyone? All right. Well, then with
Oh,
that.
I do.
Oh,
I think
okay.
she's got a question.
Oh.
You.
I have a question. Diane, any evidence of birds and humans communicating? In other words, birds kind of getting their attention or something, or?
Well, I don't know about you, but when I am late in the morning putting bird seed out on my deck and the birds just sit outside my window and look at me, I think they're communicating with me. But no, I mean, I don't know if you heard the story about this woman named Irene Pepperberg, who had a parrot named Alex. It was an African gray parrot that she communicated with all the time. The parrot learned many words and could ask for things, specific things like I want water or I want the marble or whatever. And so there absolutely is evidence for that. I think they, when you think about a flock of birds that are communicating with each other, and you think about the way that wolves have got bred as dogs because they communicate with us in ways, and birds can do the same kinds of things. There's evidence, in fact, that ravens will communicate with wolves to tell them where prey is, so the wolves will kill the prey and the ravens can then feed on the carcass. So I think that, I made the joke about the birds, communicating with me to put seed out, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happens all the time.
I think you're muted, Mark. There you go.
It's asking if there are any other questions. All right. Well, with that, everybody, thank you so much. Dr. Schlinger, our ornithologist in residence, thank you so much for your time tonight and your wisdom. Thank you for being at Bernheim.
Thank you all.
Hope to see you at Bernheim soon.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.